If you've watched previous episodes in this series, you'll have heard me mention that Final Fantasy was always evolving. It wasn't the only thing. The consoles on which the series appeared would also evolve and change. After 3 entries on the NES, it was time to go 16-bit. With the Super NES offering more power, both graphically and computationally, the opportunity had arrived to take the series to the next level. There were plenty of possibilities on the table that didn't make it into Final Fantasy, but were incorporated into other Square titles in development at the time. Perhaps one day we'll take a closer look at them. For now, we're examining how Final Fantasy used the additional power, and asking how successful was this next step in the evolution of the series. You probably won't need 3 guesses. Let's get stuck in to Final Fantasy IV as I continue my quest to play through Final Fantasy from the top. The first release of Final Fantasy IV was, predictably, in Japan on the Super Famicom in July 1991. It would make its way across the Pacific to North America for a release in November of that year, as Final Fantasy II. If you've been following this series, you know the reason. The actual Final Fantasy II and its follow-up Final Fantasy III were not released outside of Japan until the next millennium. The lack of 2 and 3 in the West also resulted in the developers of the localization making the game easier to make it feel more like a follow-up to the first game. For a time, it was assumed that because the game is easier, that it is based on Final Fantasy IV Easy Type, a version of the game aimed at a younger audience, but the consensus has shifted in more recent years. Given that translations, or any changes to in-game text, required dedicated development time at that point in history, for things such as memory allocation and storage considerations, and that Easy Type was released only 35 days before this Final Fantasy II, it seems highly unlikely that the US release was based on this version. The localization itself is also rather rough. The game predates Square's decision to implement dedicated localization teams, so much like the first Final Fantasy, there are many lines that are bordering on nonsensical. Others became so beloved that even in future, more polished translations, they were kept as is. The next release for the game was on the PS1, and again, this game can't seem to avoid confusion. Now known as Final Fantasy IV to the whole world, it was released internationally as part of compilations. The actual compilation it appeared on depends on where you were. In North America, it appeared on Final Fantasy Chronicles, released in 2001, alongside Chrono Trigger, another RPG developed by Square. In Europe, it was part of 2002's Final Fantasy Anthology with Final Fantasy V. Despite the different compilations, they are, to the best of my knowledge, the exact same game. The script was entirely rewritten for these releases, and all versions used the Japanese difficulty, but beyond that featured very few changes from the SNES version. The next releases turned up in 2005 or 6 location dependent, as Final Fantasy IV Advance. Like Dawn of Souls, the GBA versions of the first 2 games in the series, Final Fantasy IV Advance includes additional bonus dungeons. It also includes a few graphical and interface alterations, alongside a few tweaks to the script. The 1.0 version of this release did add a selection of bugs, which were fixed in the 1.1 edition that came to Europe. 2008 saw another version of the game. This time though, it wasn't a simple port. Following from Final Fantasy III's 3D remake, Final Fantasy IV got the same treatment, being remade in 3D for the Nintendo DS. The script was retranslated once again, but with a number of original team members supervising development, this version also added a number of elements that had been trimmed out of the original Final Fantasy IV due to limitations on cartridge space. None of the additional material is critical, it simply fleshes out the existing narrative. The biggest changes in this version came in the form of gameplay alterations. I won't go too in depth on most of the changes. The main point is that the game became substantially more difficult, which does have some ramifications that I'll talk about later. The PSP got its own version of Final Fantasy IV in 2011, as part of the Final Fantasy IV Complete Collection, which included a brand new interlude and the sequel story, The After Years, which was originally released episodically in Japan on various mobile phones and the Nintendo Wii, but now compiled into a single game. This version of Final Fantasy IV returns to 2D, with all of the usual improvements that the first two titles received on the handheld. It features all of the content of the advanced version, with very minor script tweaks. Finally, we come to the iOS, Android and Steam releases. I'm lumping these together as differences between them are marginal. They are all based on the DS version, with a few little features that relied on DS specific hardware being cut out. Sadly, at time of writing, these versions have not been granted a major patch like Final Fantasy III received in early 2020. Visually, they are still acceptable in most areas, but battles have a painfully low frame rate. As in, without some modification, battles are capped at 15 frames per second, and altering this frame rate cap has knock-on effects with the battle system. Like last time, I did a full playthrough of the PC version and sampled the others. As always, we'll look at gameplay first. Once again, the general principle is still mostly the same. Travel an overworld, visiting towns and dungeons and fighting in battles. The biggest change? Those battles are no longer strictly turn-based in the traditional sense. Before we jump into the major revolution, I'll quickly touch on some smaller changes that were made which are unique to this game. When you enter a battle, the first change you see is the size of your party. You can now have up to 5 party members in battle at any one time. You'll likely also notice that the party stands in a recognisable formation. Rows are in play here, though they work slightly differently to before. Where rows were completely down to player choice in Final Fantasies II and III, here in Final Fantasy IV things are more strict. You have 2 rows, one of 2 party members and one of 3 party members. You can swap who is in which row anytime you're out of battle, and you can choose which row is in front and which is behind. These rows can be switched in battle, a command which affects the whole party for a single character's action. As far as mechanics are concerned, the rows act in the same way as Final Fantasy III, where back row characters take and deal less physical damage with most weapons. So, like before, you generally want spellcasters in the back row, with melee focused party members up front. Speaking of roles, the job system is mostly out. While most of the characters have named classes that in many cases are jobs straight from Final Fantasy III, there is no longer any free-form role switching or party composition. This is predominantly because of the developers' focus on story for this game. We'll get into that later, and I'll also cover the roles we do see soon. Last change to mention that affects all releases is the switch back to the MP pool system as opposed to spell charges. This is what many would consider the traditional or standard magic system of a Final Fantasy game. I will briefly mention a mechanic exclusive to the 3D versions, the Augment system. Augments are single-use items that you can equip onto characters that provide them with certain bonuses. Some of them are boosts to statistics, but the majority grant abilities to the character to whom they are equipped. Some of these abilities are passive effects, while others are special commands that could be used by former party members. To accommodate these potential extra commands, the player is now able to customise their command list. You're still limited in the amount of commands you can have at any one time though. You can also set an auto battle command from the same menu that, as the name implies, will be used when you turn on auto battle, instead of Final Fantasy III's method of repeating the last action. Okay, enough dawdling, let's get to the big one. The major battle system change that would remain for 6 games and practically defined Final Fantasy for most of a decade. The ATB system. ATB stands for Active Time Battle. Created by Hiroyuki Ito, the goal in its development was to mitigate the reduced amount of party customization that resulted from the overall game's focus on narrative, by making combat itself more intricate. Ito believed, correctly as it turns out, that battles in JRPGs would eventually be done in real time, and aimed to create something that felt as close to real time as was possible. Thus, ATB was born. The principle is that each combatant, party member or enemy monster, has their own ATB meter that must fill before they get a turn. In early versions, this meter was not visible, even on the player's own party members, which could cause minor issues if you weren't paying close attention to whose turn had actually come up. Once the ATB meter is filled, you will get to choose that character's action. You should know the basic list of actions by now. Each character also has special abilities that I'll mention when I cover the character classes that are available. Choosing an action is also where the difference between ATB modes, active and wait, comes into play. In active mode, time will continue to flow, and other ATB meters will still be filling up no matter what you are doing, giving battles a more fast-paced and tension-filled atmosphere. Wait mode pauses the ATB gauges while you are in any of the sub-menus, but not on the basic command list. This is useful if you want to think about your strategy and select the correct spell or item without the enemy smashing away at your team, because enemy monsters will act as soon as their ATB gauge fills. The game includes a rudimentary AI system for enemy actions, with a base script that controls the usual actions, but also featuring alternate scripts that trigger when certain conditions are met. Enemies may also retaliate or counterattack after certain player actions. On top of this, there are some effects and transformations, particularly in boss battles, that occur based on a timer. An early boss provides an example to the player of this feature. After a certain amount of time, the boss will become incorporeal and immune to attacks, so the player must effectively sit and wait until it is solid again before attacking. In this game, there is effectively a second stage to the ATB meter though, where enemies get to act instantly. When the player has selected an action, that action must then charge. Some actions, such as attack or defend, happen almost instantly, or at least added to the action queue instantly. Abilities and spells though will take longer to charge. Generally, the stronger the spell, the longer it takes to charge up and activate. You do have the ability to manipulate the ATB meter to a certain extent. First off, the base rate at which the meter charges depends on the combatant's agility or speed stat. You can then further affect this through the use of spells such as Haste, which doubles the charging rate, Slow, which halves it, and Stop, which stops it. You can also change the global speed of the ATB system from the game settings to fine-tune the system to your personal taste. Somewhat useful if you want to ease off on the pace for a boss battle, or speed things up when grinding, which seems to be mainly reserved for the much more difficult 3D versions. More on that later. For now, let's take a look at the characters we use during these active time battles, and the gameplay roles they take up. Given the narrative focus of this game, some of the following will contain spoilers, so if you'd like to remain spoiler-free, skip ahead to the time shown. With the narrative being the main driving force in the game, you'll find that party members drop in and out as and when the plot requires, much like the guest characters of Final Fantasy II. It's somewhat less daunting here though, as with 5 character slots to fill, it's rare that you'll be without something crucial like a healer for any extended amount of time. In fact, the environment is often tailored around the party you have access to at the time, though it can be annoying to have spent a lot of time with certain characters, grinding them up to a certain level of strength, only for them to leave the party permanently. In the GBA and PSP versions, during the endgame portion you are able to change the party and use some earlier characters instead. In the other releases though, your party is fixed to the plot. Let's get into what's on offer. Our main protagonist, Cecil, is the only party member who is with us for the entire game. He starts out as a Dark Knight for the Kingdom of Baron, staying pretty true to that job as it appeared in Final Fantasy III. One of the major plot moments though, is the culmination of his redemption arc and his transformation into a paladin, which is basically a renamed knight, even down to the cover ability triggering automatically for allies with critical HP. Kain Highwind is the first party member to join. If you remember much about Final Fantasy II, that name might sound familiar. Like Ricard Highwind from that game, Kain is a dragoon, like Cecil in the employ of the Kingdom of Baron. Again, this class is lifted straight from Final Fantasy III. Rydia is a summoner from the Village of Mist. This time, each summon has only a single effect, removing the random element. She also has access to black magic, and in the early game does have some white magic, though she loses this after certain plot events. Teller is searching for his daughter, who he believes was kidnapped. He is a famous sage, which is slightly different to Final Fantasy III's, in that he doesn't get to use summons, but still has both magic schools at his disposal. He is slightly neutered at first, as many higher level spells are unlocked after a story event, and his MP pool is permanently limited. Edward is the reluctant Crown Prince of Damcyan, and also a spoony bard. He works in a similar fashion to the Bard of Three, able to sing songs that can have varying effects. He also has the ability to hide in battle, avoiding damage but also not really participating. Rosa is a white mage of Baron, and longtime friend to Cecil and Kain. You should know the idea for this class by now. On the side though, she also has aspects of the Ranger, able to equip bows and use the aim skill to ensure a hit. Yong is the master of the Monks of Farbel, and unsurprisingly fills the monk/black belt role. He fights with his fists and can use the abilities Focus and Brace, allowing him to hit harder or take less damage. Palom and Porum are twins from the mage town of Mysidia. Black and white mages respectively, they can team up with the Twin Cast ability, allowing them to unleash a more powerful spell. Cid is also from Baron, where he is the chief designer of the kingdom's airships. In gameplay, he is an engineer, a new class that is almost like a cross between a Viking and a scholar. His main ability allows him to analyse the enemy team like the scholar, but his stats trend more towards melee fighting, with him usually wielding a large hammer. Edge is the Prince of Eblan, a kingdom of ninjas. He is obviously a ninja, but also covers the thief class too, with the main abilities from both jobs, alongside exclusive ninjutsu magic. Fusoya is the last party member, a mysterious old man from a far-off place. Another sage-type character, he is rather weak and honestly comes across as more of a plot element than a true party member. His stats don't even increase until level 70, which is a notable level for reasons we will cover in just a moment. Most of these characters have stats that follow the job roles they occupy. The stats themselves are broadly the same as before, so I'll cover the major changes and leave it at that. As mentioned earlier, speed, or agility, now controls ATB charge rate, while the accuracy and evasion stats are no longer related to the number of hits, a concept that has been retired for this game. Instead, they feed into a straightforward percentage chance of hitting or missing with any individual action. Levelling in Final Fantasy IV works in a functionally similar way to Final Fantasy III, for the most part. Each character has their own set base stats per level, up to level 70. Then things get a little more interesting. Progress beyond level 70 works in different ways for different versions, split along the 2D-3D axis. In the 2D versions, upon gaining a level above 70, the game will randomly select a profile of stat changes, of which each character has 8 different profiles. To complicate matters, some profiles will reduce stats instead of increasing them. So if you want to maximise a character's stats, you may have to spend a considerable amount of time reloading saves to ensure you get the best range of stat increases. Granted, this only really matters in the GBA and PSP versions, with their extra, more difficult content. By most accounts, the main story of the game in all of the 2D versions is easy enough that you may not even reach level 70 anyway. It should be noted, HP and MP grow on a fairly consistent but slightly random basis. Each level the character will gain a random amount between a set range for that character and level. This can result in wildly different amounts between different playthroughs, but you would have to be particularly unlucky to always get the low roll. It seems to work this way for both 2D and 3D versions. In all other respects, the 3D versions are very different. Instead of using randomness beyond level 70, they instead use an exclusive feature we've already mentioned: augments. Technically, they work through the extra abilities that augments grant. Beyond level 70, each ability equipped on a character confers set boosts to certain stats on level up. Because each augment can be applied to only one character per playthrough, and only so many abilities can be equipped at any one time, this can become quite a juggling act, as some augments are only available on a second or third playthrough. Maximising the stats of the final party isn't really possible until that final third playthrough, though it is apparently only almost needed for some of the optional super bosses. Unfortunately, I couldn't confirm this, as time constraints don't combine well with the concept of playing a 30+ hour game 3 times. Both 2D and 3D versions treat magic in the same way though. New spells are learned at set levels, the available spells and their levels of unlocking are predetermined, but will vary between character and between version too. This sounds like something fairly standard, but is actually a first for Final Fantasy. Some story events will also unlock certain spells and abilities too. On the subject of magic, this is the game where elemental properties, and therefore weaknesses and resistances, really start to become more widely used. While growing in usage across previous games, even in Final Fantasy III, their use was often more of a gimmick in very particular areas or with particular families of monster. In Final Fantasy IV, almost every area has monsters with some sort of elemental property, so scanning the enemy in some way is a good habit to learn. Rydia's summons, or Eidolons as they are called in later versions, also often have elemental properties. Their method of unlocking is a little different to Black and White magic though. When Rydia returns to the party, she has a range of summons available to her, but by no means all of them. There are a number of other summons to find, with 2 methods of acquisition. The first group is unlocked by finding specific items after battles with certain common enemies. The other group works like some of the later Final Fantasy III summons, in that you must prove your worth in combat against the Eidolon before you can call on their aid. The journey to unlock these summons forms something of a subplot for Rydia, but we'll get to story elements soon. So what are my thoughts on the gameplay? In general, I'm very positive towards Final Fantasy IV, though I do have some small negatives to mention, particularly about the ATB system. In many ways, it lacks polish, which is understandable as the first iteration of such a revolutionary battle system. Predominantly, it seems to operate at either extreme, even on the same speed setting. Either you are sitting there, twiddling your thumbs, waiting for the gauges to fill before you can do anything, gradually getting more bored and exasperated, or, at the other end, you are stressed and rushing to try and get your actions input before the boss class monster smashes you with 13 attacks in a row. Obviously, that's a touch hyperbolic, but it illustrates the point. The system lacks tuning, which makes the more difficult 3D versions even more so, to the point that more casual players may feel oppressed, particularly in later game dungeons, where red dragons are laying down multiple thermal rays in quick succession, dealing thousands of points of damage across the party with each one before you even get a chance to heal. This is my biggest complaint, and the biggest positive certainly outweighs it. That being that the gameplay, particularly character classes and progression, works alongside the story, supporting it and enhancing its depth without having to explicitly tell the player certain things in exposition dumps. On which note, like Final Fantasy IV itself, I'm going to change up the formula and look at the narrative elements next. As always when discussing story, there will be spoilers, so please skip ahead if you wish to avoid them. As mentioned previously, despite the large changes to the battle system, the main focus of Final Fantasy IV throughout its development was in fact the story. The lead designer, Takashi Takita, has gone on record saying that as much as 3/4 of the script had to be cut out to fit on the cartridges that were available at the time, though none of this cut content was classed as necessary. Some of this cut content was restored in the 3D versions, providing additional character moments through cutscenes, without affecting the main plot in any major way. The 3D versions also included some extra character development in a kind of novel way. Whenever you go into the main menu, you will get a glimpse into the thoughts of the character you are currently using to explore the overworld. Again, none of it is necessary, but it does add that little bit more to the characters, although it is easy to forget to check. We've already discussed the various character roles from a gameplay standpoint, but the way these roles also appear in the narrative is one of the key reasons that Final Fantasy IV's story is so effective for a game released in 1991. These roles are not just used for establishing characters, they also support the development of the characters as the game progresses. The biggest example of this is, as you might expect, our main character Cecil. He starts out the game as a Dark Knight, gradually becoming more disaffected by his dependence on that darkness and the acts he has been ordered to commit. His journey up Mount Ordeals, a touch on the nose as a location name, is one of the key plot moments, culminating in Cecil making the decision to use the light instead, transforming into a paladin and being reinforced by his new white magic abilities. Story events also have other, less seismic effects. Edge unlocks some additional ninjutsu abilities when he reaches a peak of his arc, while Teller remembers all of his old magic as a major step in his journey. Not all character arcs have gameplay ramifications, most are more traditionally played out, such as Edward's arc of overcoming his own cowardice being very similar to that of Gordon, one of the standouts of Final Fantasy II. Other characters, such as Palom and Porum, serve as comic relief, but also stand by Cecil, initially to keep a wary eye on him, then, after his transformation, to help him to protect their homes from the bad guys. Speaking of which, we have a step in the right direction when it comes to villainous motivation and depth. Granted, some of the elemental archfiends are just typical evil because they are, but some others do have at least a modicum of personality. The primary antagonist gets a bit of growth throughout the game, coming to a head with a twist that has been used enough in games since that it would likely be considered cliché in a modern game. The final ultimate antagonist is unfortunately a rather one-dimensional embodiment of hatred, which I guess is a step above an embodiment of darkness at least. The most basic description of the plot is a race to acquire the 4 crystals and their underworld counterparts in order to prevent the villain from using their power to reach the moon and attain an even greater power. There is plenty more to it, but potentially giving away spoilers for the end of this video, I'd rather not spoil any more of it than I already have. I will admit that the majority of the narrative is within the actual individual character arcs, which isn't a bad thing at all. Characters are what gives any story emotional weight. An epic series of plot points without any characters to invest in is little better than a history, not a story. The pacing of the story is pretty much on point. It isn't too plodding, but doesn't rush things so fast that everything blurs into one. The narrative is also very good at making your next objective clear to you, without having to drop giant markers down. Exposition is also handled very well, with most details revealed gradually. There's no mass dumps of information to process all at once. The way party members cycle also supports the gameplay and narrative, keeping both fresh and renewing your interest regularly. Character arrivals and departures are usually worked into their character arc, generally setting up the next story beat or closing out a certain section. Greater use is made of cutscenes compared to earlier titles, utilising the power of the SNES to great effect. The goal was to give an almost cinematic quality to the narrative presentation, and it certainly succeeds. The 3D versions expand on the cutscenes, separating them from the top-down view and even featuring voice acting. It gives the cutscenes greater significance and holds your attention better than text boxes do. Granted, the voice acting is not going to be winning any awards, and the choices for some characters border on parody.
It's loud! This one too!
But it does the job and supports the story. There is something of a trade-off though. The added difficulty of the 3D games results in occasional periods of grinding that can slam the brakes on, bringing the story to an abrupt halt. There are few things more disheartening than being gripped by a story and suddenly not being able to continue. It's like reading a book, only for somebody to tear it out of your hands and refuse to give it back until you have completed a certain quantity of mundane tasks. On top of that, if it's a boss encounter that blocks you, you may be forced to re-watch lengthy cutscenes in the event of failure. This is not necessarily always a bad thing, as grinding can take long enough that it bridges play sessions, so a reminder might actually be a good thing. Taking all versions of the game into account, the narrative elements of Final Fantasy IV are one giant leap ahead of the NES titles. They are engaging and they help to drive the player forward through the game. The way that gameplay complements narrative is fantastic and really helps to ingratiate the player within the story. It isn't just gameplay that assists the story though. The design of the world also works in tandem with the narrative. The world design supports the narrative in more ways than just simply being where the narrative takes place. Pacing of the story is assisted by the transport-based gatekeeping. It's still present, but here it just feels much more natural. Obviously, it helps prevent you from going to certain places until the plot is ready, but it rarely feels like an arbitrary obstacle. There's often moments where the story will leave you bereft of your vehicle as well, but again, these feel like natural progressions for the story, rather than dissonant roadblocks that spring up to force you to undertake a certain task. Which is what they are doing really, but it doesn't feel that way. Thus in turn, the world design is supported by the narrative, with the player forced to explore more of the world's content instead of just flying over the top of it. The transport options themselves have been largely scaled back. The canoe is gone, replaced by the hovercraft, which serves a similar enough purpose of letting you pass certain barriers. For the first time, we don't get a ship to personally control, though we do take one trip in a scripted sequence. Airships are here though, with 3 of them available through the course of the game. The Enterprise functions traditionally, with all the usual landing restrictions. Later on, it is upgraded with a hook for transporting the hovercraft to different locations. The Falcon is very much the same, only really differing in appearance and lacking the hook. The final airship is needed to access the final overworld map, which I won't spoil here. It is much larger, and like the Invincible from Final Fantasy III, features an interior that you can actually explore. It doesn't offer much, mainly a healing station and a fat chocobo point inside. On that subject, chocobos return, though chocobo woods are rather sparse this time. They do feature some additional varieties of chocobo though. White chocobos can't be ridden, but they do replenish the party's MP, and the player will also encounter the black chocobo. This one can be ridden, and allows you to fly over various obstacles. It contrasts with the airships in that the black chocobo can actually land in forests. Like previous games, regular chocobos are not worth going out of your way for. They are still neat, but they just aren't really helped by only being present on the first overworld map. In the same template as Final Fantasy III, 4 has multiple overworlds. 3, in fact. The first is the main one, and has the most to do. As far as actual design goes, it's fairly standard. There's nothing in particularly wrong with it, but it's not anything too special. The second and third overworlds, which are both fairly large spoilers, have a lot less content than the main overworld, but are also comparatively smaller, partially avoiding the problems of Final Fantasy III's world design. The gradual exploration of all 3 overworlds is led by the story, helping to drip feed new environments to keep the player interested while still being narratively consistent. The selection of towns in Final Fantasy IV falls somewhere between 2 and 3, in both number and general quality. Many of them follow the same route as Final Fantasy II's towns, in that they are more focused on story rather than being simple pit stops. They don't change to the same extent that some towns do in Final Fantasy II, but there is some reaction after certain story events. Most of the towns have a distinctive character, not just visually, but also in the actions and attitude of the residents. The available services have received a few small changes. With magic spells being learned by levelling, magic shops are omitted, and sanctuaries seem to be gone too, with inns reviving characters who have fallen in battle as part of their function. Despite losing a couple of buildings, towns aren't that much smaller. Instead, there are usually a few buildings that are simply NPC homes, and often help to give some more of that character to each town. As for dungeons, for the most part they are similar to those in Final Fantasy III. There is a decent amount of diversity in visual design, and layout is reasonably varied between compact and sprawling. They do sometimes err on the longer side, though it is nowhere near as detrimental as it was in Final Fantasy II. For one thing, there are no monster closets, but there is also one simple feature that vastly improves the dungeon experience: save points. These areas, usually in their own side rooms just off the main path, allow you to save the game mid-dungeon, and use tents and cottages as if you were on the overworld. By removing the potential threat of having to replay the whole dungeon, they become slightly less daunting, but it is a small price to pay for avoiding the undeniable frustration and aggravation caused by an hour's worth of time wasted. If you want to get back that feeling, you can always choose to ignore the save points. I will admit that even with the existence of save points, some of the later dungeons were of great enough length to try my patience. This has roots in the greater difficulty of the version I played, where even some regular encounters in the later dungeons could be multiple minute fights. The second reason the dungeon was approaching frustrating is mainly that the story is so motivating, to the point that I just wanted to find out what happens next, and getting bogged down having to wade through 10 floors of damage sponge enemies starts to chafe after a while. The GBA and PSP versions also have some bonus dungeons for the player to contend with. Offering endgame level enemies and a raft of extra bosses, these dungeons provide some powerful loot as a reward. The second bonus dungeon has some other interesting properties, in that each character still available to the player has their own trial. These aren't solo missions, but that character must be in the party and the trial is themed around that character and their story arc. Completing all of the trials will unlock a super boss version of the final boss of the game. Sadly, these dungeons were removed from the 3D versions. Though they do feature some optional super bosses, they just aren't as engaging as whole dungeons. On the whole, the dungeons are still good, but they're just not perfect by any stretch. The extra power granted by the jump to the SNES is obviously used to improve presentation. More colours and details are able to be shown, vastly improving the environments and enemy details. Unfortunately, when it comes to character sprites, the developers opted to use the same relative dimensions as they did in the NES games, which restricts their detail a little. Sound is a much bigger improvement, with 8 channels available to compositions, allowing for music with much more depth and complexity. There's some more recognisable tunes in this game, with the battle music being referenced outside of the games, and the opening track heralding fond memories for many. I talked last time about how Final Fantasy III set the standard for the interfaces of the series, and 4 doesn't particularly change from this template in any major way. Even with some differing features, the actual menu layouts are much the same, and anybody who played 3 would feel right at home. The PS1 version makes very few changes. In fact, other than a rewritten script, it is basically a straight port of the SNES version, with visuals and audio kept intact. The GBA port brings bigger visual changes. Many character sprites have been edited slightly, brightening and enhancing the colours, while character portraits have been redrawn. The game follows Final Fantasy II's GBA release, where the character portraits are shown during that character's dialogue, a touch that gives clarity to who is speaking. The translation is based on the PlayStation script, with a few improvements here and there. Sound, on the other hand, does take a bit of a hit, which you were probably expecting me to say given the hardware. The interface has been slightly altered in this version, with the ATB gauges for the player's party now shown on screen, bringing it more in line with the later SNES Final Fantasies. For the DS remake, like that of Final Fantasy III, everything went 3D. It doesn't look bad on the DS, and makes much better use of the handheld's features than 3 did. Instead of the second screen remaining blank within towns and dungeons, Final Fantasy IV uses them for a map. This is helpful in towns when you just want to go to a specific shop and then get back out there. It's much more interactive within dungeons though. While you travel through a dungeon floor, the map gradually fills out as you explore. Completing the map of a floor grants the player some bonus items, encouraging players to fully explore and offering a pretty large hint that they may have missed a hidden passage somewhere. The touchscreen gets some usage for various minigames, all of which revolve around a special summon that is exclusive to this version of the game. It was removed from the ports of this version, despite 2 of them being touchscreen devices. As previously mentioned, there has been yet another script rewrite, not only improving translation, but adding the formerly cut content that is also present in this version. The voice acting in some cutscenes does mean that you can no longer change character names. The soundtrack also gets an upgrade, with remastered tracks that sound less like chiptune. There are plenty of other changes, including the first chronological appearance of Auto Battle and the Augment system. New Game Plus is another new feature that we have yet to encounter, appearing in a few other games in the series. Here it carries over all of your unlocked augments, certain special summons, and some equipment and items that are of a certain rarity. It also unlocks the super bosses. The PSP returns to a 2D perspective, but like the first two games, it isn't just a straight port. All of the sprite work has been completely redone, bringing the designs to a level on par with the PSP versions of Final Fantasy 1 and 2. While the game is mostly the same as the advanced version in content, a couple of scenes have been enhanced for this version. As for the soundtrack, you are actually given a choice. You can play with the original SNES soundtrack, or the updated DS version, with the ability to switch as you please. Interfaces receive nearly no changes. In fact, the only difference appears to be allowing the player to choose a new wallpaper for menus and dialogue boxes. Finally, we come to the most recent versions. These versions use the DS release as their basis, though there are some changes. Resolution does get a boost, but like 3, nothing has been remade for higher definition. Where this wasn't a major concern in Final Fantasy 3, the art style used in 4 has not aged as well. It doesn't look horrible by any means, but where the art style of Final Fantasy 3 complemented the low poly models, Final Fantasy 4's tone does not. The field of view is also disconcertingly close at first. You do adapt quickly, and much of the dungeon design would potentially be affected if they allowed you to zoom it out, but it can feel very limiting at times. The frame rate in battles is a big issue too. 15 frames per second is simply not adequate. While there is a notable difference between 30 and 60 frames per second, and more certainly is better, consistency is often more important. To me, a constant 30 is better than fluctuating between 60 and 40, because once you are engrossed in the game, you more readily notice the change than the actual rate. Obviously, a constant 60 or even higher would be ideal. This is where the battle frame rate is so detrimental though. The rest of the game runs at 30. For that to be suddenly cut in half every time you go into a battle is jarring and makes you notice how jerky the movement is even more. I did mention earlier there is a way to modify this on the PC version. However, the actual ATB mechanics seem to be fixed to the frame rate, which strikes me as a phenomenally bad idea. It was acceptable back on the SNES when the entire system worked on the same cycles, and I can understand limiting the frame rate in the DS version given the lack of real power in the system, but keeping the ATB rate tied to it is a little baffling. Leaving it this way for later ports is not good though. It comes across as lazy, and it does impact the game in a tangible way. It means that trying to increase the frame rate also increases ATB charge rate considerably, and while you can slow it down with the inbuilt options, you are effectively limited to just 3 options because all of the others race by so quickly. On the positive side, the interfaces of these versions are not as obtuse as they were on the original Steam release's Final Fantasy III. They appear designed for both touch and controller usage, which is probably the wisest move. As of yet, the PC version does not support touch or mice, though perhaps this might be changed if a Final Fantasy III 2020 style patch is released in the future. Before we wrap up, I will quickly cover the direct sequels to Final Fantasy IV. There are actually 2 sequels, Final Fantasy IV Interlude, which is exclusive to the PSP within the Final Fantasy IV Complete Collection, and Final Fantasy IV The After Years. The After Years has two versions that are still available now. Originally, it was released episodically for some mobile phones and on the Nintendo Wii's WiiWare download service, though none of these storefronts are active anymore. Instead, there is a 2D version included in the Complete Collection, which is a compiled port of all of the episodes, and then there is a 3D version, remade like the main game, that was released for smart devices and the PC. This 3D version uses the same engine as the main game, and thus has many of the same problems. Gameplay in both the Interlude and After Years uses the same core from Final Fantasy IV itself, with a few additional features. Primarily, they exist to continue the story. Interlude is, as the name suggests, a short experience that exists to link the end of Final Fantasy IV to the story of the After Years. Conversely, the After Years is much closer to a full game, though with more of an episodic presentation. Taking place 17 years later, the game follows many of the same characters, as well as some of their children. Both of these games are pretty much fan service, which isn't derogatory in this case. Enough people liked Final Fantasy IV that they decided to continue the story, and now the option exists for the rest of us to spend a little more time in the world of Cecil and Company. Sadly, that's all the time I can devote to these sequels. Let's finish things up. Despite my complaints, and while some versions are better than others, Final Fantasy IV is still brilliant in all its forms. The gameplay is great, the ATB system is a whole new way to conduct battles, and fulfills its objective of making battles more intricate, while also increasing the tension and giving a sense of time being a factor. The variety of characters and skills still allows for plenty of strategy, even without full party customization. The world is decent, if nothing special. It competently sets the stage and provides a good variety of locations. Dungeons are reasonable, with only one or two being on the long side, and that's only really an issue on harder versions. The main feature of Final Fantasy IV is, of course, the story. Much of the development was centred on narrative, and it shows. This is by far the best story of the series so far, and probably would be even without the support of gameplay and world design elements. With the rest of the game's design supporting the narrative, it helps elevate it to a story that still holds up today. This is definitely a game worth playing, never even mind a Final Fantasy game worth playing. Which version though? It's a good question, and like many of the other games, depends on what your personal focus is. The SNES version, despite being the original, doesn't have that much to really recommend it. The translation is very rough, and it is, while likely not based upon easy type, still extremely easy, to the point where some describe it as press A to win. The PS1 version is a slightly better translation, and is closer to the first release in difficulty, but beyond that it is basically the same. Final Fantasy IV Advance has portability on its side, and has the bonus dungeons to provide some extra content. Some enemy stats are changed though, which does make the game easier. The 1.0 version, which was released in North America, has many bugs, though most of these were fixed in the 1.1 that came to Europe. I'll round out the 2D versions with the PSP release. It is by far the best looking even now, and soundtrack choice is welcome if you have a particular preference. It includes all of the positives of the GBA game, with the bonus dungeons and portability, and while it lacks some of the story additions of the DS version, it includes Interlude and the After Years for much more narrative content in a single package. Difficulty is the same as the GBA version though. The DS version is probably the best of the 3D editions visually, purely on account of it being designed for the system. The difficulty is ramped up well beyond any 2D versions, and it does have a small amount of extra story content. The remastered soundtrack is pleasant to listen to, but some may miss the distinctiveness of the SNES chiptune version. The ports of the 3D game are a mixed bag. They aren't as visually appealing, especially on larger screens, and the frame rate issues are difficult to even consider defending. So overall, if you are in for the story alone, I would recommend the PSP release. While it doesn't have the extra scenes from the 3D game, you won't have to contend with a large amount of grinding and getting held back from the story by the difficulty. It does also include both sequels in the package, so if you fall in love with the characters and the world, you can continue their stories straight away. If you are after intricate game mechanics and a decent challenge, the 3D versions are your best bet, with the augment system having plenty of depth for the inquisitive player. Just keep in mind the flaws, or cross your fingers and hope they release a patch that reworks the frame rate during battles. So, Final Fantasy IV is done. Despite some flaws to iron out, this is a fantastic start to the SNES era. The game embodies almost everything that Final Fantasy brings to mind. Gameplay that is not only fun, but has a decent amount of depth and strategy, alongside stories that grab you and refuse to let go until you reach the conclusion. But how would the growth of the series continue? We'll find out next time as I play through Final Fantasy V from the top.